The People's Pharmacy podcast is supported in part by CocoVia. CocoVia cocoflavanols support both cardiovascular health and cognitive function by promoting healthy blood flow, transporting oxygen and nutrients to vital organs and muscles, including your heart and brain.
CocoVia now comes in an even more concentrated formula, with 450 milligrams of cocoflavanols, 5 times more than the leading dark chocolate bar and 15 times more than the leading cocoa powder.
CocoVia has a proprietary process that preserves cocoflavanols at the highest levels, and the product undergoes rigorous testing at every stage, which allows them to guarantee the highest level of cocoflavanols per serving and to provide the purest, highest quality product possible.
People's Pharmacy listeners can now try CocoVia for 25% off by using the code Peoples25 at cocavia.com. That's COCOAVIA.com. Americans swallow more than 100 billion pills a year. Could food be medicine? What's the scientific evidence to support that idea? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Dr. William Lee wrote, "Eat to Beat Disease, the new science of how the body can heal itself." He's especially interested in cancer.
We now know that it's possible to have cancer without disease. And the difference between having cancer that is deadly versus cancer that our bodies can take care of is the failure or the evasion of our normal health defense systems.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, we'll learn about angiogenesis and how foods can impact our immune system. What foods inhibit new blood vessel growth?
First, this news. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. In the early 19th century, philosopher and writer Brillat-Savarin wrote, "You are what you eat." Of course, he said it in French, so it sounded more elegant. In the mid-20th century, author Adele Davis popularized this message. Have we forgotten it?
Today, we are exploring the evidence for food as medicine. To do so, we turn to Dr. William Lee. He's a physician, researcher, and president and founder of the Angiogenesis Foundation. He's worked on the development of more than 30 new medical treatments and served on the faculty of Harvard Medical School. His book is Eat to Beat Disease, the new science of how your body can heal itself.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. William Lee.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Dr. Lee, you worked with one of the most extraordinary researchers that we've ever had the opportunity to interview, Dr. Judah Folkman. Your background is in the field of angiogenesis, which is what he was studying. What exactly is this big word, angiogenesis, and why is it so important?
Angiogenesis is a Greek word, and angio refers to blood, and genesis is growing. And angiogenesis simply is the growth of blood vessels and how our body grows and nurtures its circulation. I was one of Dr. Judah Folkman's original students back in the 1980s and was privileged to learn how a true visionary of science imagines an idea, develops it in a laboratory, confronts both colleagues as well as critics to develop the data and evidence supporting a new idea, and then how it is actually brought all the way to new treatments for human disease. So angiogenesis is a complicated word, but I think over time we're going to be hearing more and more about it in the same way that antibiotics back in the 1940s was a difficult word and everybody knows it now.
Dr. Lee, in your book, Eat to Beat Disease, you suggest that health is an active process, not just the absence of disease. What do you mean?
Well, I'm a medical doctor. I trained at Massachusetts General Hospital, which is one of the Harvard teaching hospitals, and I also went to medical school at the University of Pittsburgh, where I spent a decade learning about disease and how to treat it using medicines, surgery, and many of the advanced tools that we have today in medicine that are life-saving tools. I've also been involved through my work at the Angiogenesis Foundation, which is a nonprofit, to drive forward better treatments to help people live better lives. But in all of this, one of the things that I realized when I was taking care of my patients who would receive a deadly diagnosis or a difficult diagnosis, and they would ask, what it is that they could do for themselves, I started to realize that there was something missing from the vernacular of medicine, and that is really a true dialogue about and understanding about health itself. So when I say that health is not the absence of disease, because that's what we normally think of, what is it then? And that's really what I've turned my research towards, which is to use everything I know about disease fighting and biotechnology, frankly, and to ask that question, what is health? And what does it mean to be healthy? The answer is really quite fascinating. Our health is not an absence of anything, but rather a series of hardwired defense systems that we are born with when we emerge from our mother's womb all the way until our last breath. Our body is working to protect itself through these health defense systems that help our circulation. They help regenerate our organs and replace older tissues. They communicate with our bacteria in our healthy gut. They protect our DNA, and they actually boost our immunity. And so health is really a system of health defenses that are firing on all cylinders, protecting our bodies against the assaults of our environment and our lives.
Let's talk about food. Because I think if we go back to Hippocrates' days, let food be your medicine, a lot of your colleagues probably think of that as kind of new agey, crystals, kind of flaky. And yet, at the very heart of your book, there is this sense that there's real science, that this is not flaky at all, that the food we consume can affect this thing you've referred to as angiogenesis. So tell us what you mean by food as medicine.
As exactly as you described, the idea of food as medicine goes back 2,000 years to Hippocrates, who's attributed to saying, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. But really 2,000 years later, many cultures actually agree with that idea that what we eat matters to our health. And I think most doctors that I work with also know that intuitively, but against the culture of biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, we sometimes are challenged by, well, how much evidence is there for food? And that's really something that's captured my attention by asking if food actually helps activate the body's health defense systems. What is the evidence for that? How is it studied? How do we understand how that could change people's lives? And how do we get other researchers and policymakers and collaborators to come into this field to develop it? Now, 10 years ago, the idea of food as medicine was considered to be much more fringe, as you suggest. But I think now, in 2019, and I think we're going to see this going into the next few years, there's new momentum being picked up. For example, insurance companies are beginning to actually pay special attention to healthy diets as an incentive to be able to keep people on the spectrum of where insurance companies would like people to be, which is healthy, not sick. Medical schools, some of the more avant-garde ones, are beginning to teach culinary medicine in their courses as electives. State health departments are beginning to look at, there's a Massachusetts, for example, where I live, a food as medicine policy. And recently, in fact, just a couple of weeks ago at the United Nations, there was a major presentation by a Eat Lancet commission that was funded by the United Kingdom Wellcome Trust to begin looking at the the framework supported by science of a diet that was both healthy for people as well as the planet. So and also on Capitol Hill, Congress now has a bipartisan food as medicine working group. So I think while only a decade ago, this is a fringe idea, food as medicine, today we're really starting to see a crystallization of serious interest, and it's only made possible because there's real science behind it.
Dr. Lee, you gave a TED Talk, Can We Eat to Starve Cancer? And you suggest that a lot of us have tiny cancers developing in our bodies quite frequently, and yet they don't develop into actual tumors. Can you tell us more about that? Why don't we develop cancer more often?
Well, it's really a fascinating question to ask because just being healthy and going about our ways, our bodies have about 10,000 mistakes that happen in our DNA's replication every single day. That's the estimated number of errors that occur. And we know that cancer develops from DNA errors. So one of the questions is, why don't we actually wake up every day and having cancers develop from the mutations from the day before? It's really fascinating to think about this because our body is naturally designed to resist abnormal growth. Our immune systems, for example, send out surveillance teams to continuously look for abnormal cells and to clean up those cells when they spot them. And in fact, the development of cancer in the clinic where people notice the cancer, by that time the tumors are actually quite big and they've found a way to escape the defenses. Our body's own ability to control blood vessels, angiogenesis, is another defense system. So, for example, Judah Folkman actually was the first to determine that without a blood supply, a tumor, a small cluster of cancer cells, can't grow more than a couple of millimeters in diameter. That's about the size of the head of a ballpoint pen, tip of a ballpoint pen. And it's only when cancers are able to escape from these defenses, so they can recruit their own blood supply, they can find a way to evade the immune system, they can actually begin to establish themselves. And so what we now know is that while we don't think we have cancers, we actually have microscopic tumors that are developing, but our defenses are taking care of them all the time. A fascinating study was done, autopsy studies was done of women in their 40s who had died of trauma or car accidents, for example. And when they looked at their breasts, through an autopsy, 40% of women in their 40s already had microscopic breast cancers without ever having been diagnosed with breast cancer. In men who were in their 50s, about 50% of men, again, in an autopsy study, had microscopic prostate cancers, much higher than you actually find, clinically, but they were there. Microscopic, and most likely they would not become a problem ever. And in people, men and women who are in their 70s and older, almost 100% of people who at autopsy had their thyroid glands examined had microscopic thyroid cancers. So we now know that it's possible to have cancer without disease. And the difference between having cancer that is deadly versus cancer that our bodies can take care of is the failure or the evasion of our normal health defense systems.
You are listening to Dr. William Lee. He's president and founder of the Angiogenesis Foundation. He's helped to create more than 30 new medical treatments, and he previously served on the faculty of Harvard Medical School. His book is Eat to Beat Disease, the new science of how your body can heal itself.
We need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll learn about the 5 key defense systems our body uses to keep us healthy.
How does food affect them?
What should you eat to keep your immune system in tip-top shape?
Can you imagine a time when doctors would prescribe broccoli sprouts?
Find out which top 3 foods can boost your immune system.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This People's Pharmacy podcast is brought to you in part by Verisana.com.
Verisana Lab offers home health tests that allow you to monitor your hormones and health conditions. You can take control of the quantitative assessment of your health and learn about male and female hormone balance, the stress hormone cortisol, leaky gut, gluten intolerance, or your gut microbiome.
Take a more active role in tracking your health and take 20% off your first order of a mail-in testing opportunity with the discount code PEOPLE. That's uppercase PEOPLE. To learn more, go to verisana.com. That's VERISANA.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. If you would like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1161. That number again, 800-732-2334. Or you can visit our website, peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the free podcast from iTunes.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verisana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com.
And by Kaya Biotics, probiotic products made in Germany from certified organic ingredients. KAYA Biotics.com.
We're exploring the evidence of food as medicine today. How does food affect immune function? Are there specific foods that give the immune system a boost? How can you keep your natural defense systems in good shape? And should doctors prescribe foods that will help you stay healthy?
Our guest is Dr. William Lee. He's a physician, researcher, and president and founder of the Angiogenesis Foundation. He's worked on the development of more than 30 new medical treatments and served on the faculty of Harvard Medical School. His book is Eat to Beat Disease, the new science of how your body can heal itself.
Dr. William Lee, in your new book, Eat to Beat Disease, you talk about the 5 key defense systems that our bodies use to keep us healthy. Can you tell us, please, what are those 5 key defense systems and how does food affect them?
Well, the 5 key defense systems, and there's probably more than 5, but the 5 that actually we have really begun to take a careful look on are the angiogenesis system, which is actually how the body grows blood vessels. We need good circulation to feed every single cell in the body. And if you have too many blood vessels, it can actually feed disease tissues like cancer. And if you don't have enough blood vessels, you actually can have wounds that don't heal or hearts that are starved of oxygen and diseases like cardiovascular disease or even heart failure. So having just the right number of blood vessels, our perfect circulation is one of the ways our body is defending ourselves. Another defense system is as closely related is our regenerative system. When I was a kid, I learned that starfish can regenerate and salamanders can regenerate, but people really don't regenerate. We know that's not really true anymore, and that the human body has abundant capacity to regenerate through its own stem cells. And while we can't grow a new arm or a leg, what we can do is continuously regenerate the tissues that need to be replaced and made more healthy. And so that's another defense system, and it can be influenced by food, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Yet another health defense system is one of the most exciting areas of science and medicine today. It's called the microbiome, and most have heard of it because it generally refers to the healthy bacteria that live in our gut. And one of the things that I am fascinated by is the fact that when we refer to ourselves as I, we're actually talking about not only the human part of ourselves, but we're talking about the bacteria, the abundant bacteria that live in our body, almost 37 trillion bacteria. Think of ourselves as an ecosystem in which human cells share real estate with bacterial cells. So how is that the defense? Well, it turns out the bacteria talk to each other. They talk to our cells, our immune cells in particular, but also they talk to our brain. They can help us even influence our emotions. And the food that we eat not only feed the human cells, they feed the bacteria cells. So I'll come back to that in a second. DNA, another powerful defense system, not just as the blueprint for the proteins that make up our body and our functions, but in fact, our DNA has this remarkable ability to fix itself. So when there's a problem, a break, a mutation, our DNA knows how to actually circle back and immediately, like it's like a seamstress, sew up the problem. And so you have a perfect genetic blueprint back again. And it continuously defends itself against almost every insult possible. And while people have been thinking about sequencing and diagnosing things on DNA mutations, there's a whole other story that's emerging with DNA, which is how it protects itself and therefore our health. And then finally, our best known health defense system is our immune system. Every grandmother has told their grandchildren to drink chicken soup and to stay warm when it's cold outside to protect their immune system. But now we know that as powerful as we've always thought our immune system was, this is really the triumphant, maybe ultimate defense system of the body that can even wipe out cancer after it's metastasized. So with the new field of immune therapy for cancer, we now know that you can take somebody with cancer that's spread throughout their body. And if you give the hardwired immune system as a defense a chance, it can actually clean up all the cancer in the body and reverse a disease that was previously thought to be unconquerable. So these 5 defense systems, angiogenesis, regeneration, microbiome, DNA protection, immunity, really represent the shield that allows us to function. And each one of these can be influenced powerfully by the foods that we eat.
Let's start with the immune system, because I think a lot of people have heard about immunotherapy. They've seen commercials on television for the latest and greatest drugs, and they innately understand that a high-functioning immune system could be protective, not just against the common cold, but, as you say, against cancer. What foods would be most beneficial, the top immune-enhancing foods that we can eat on a, if not daily basis, on a regular basis?
Well, there's so many foods that are now being studied and for their impact on immunity. And before I tell you a few of them, let me just say that the way that foods impact the defense systems are being studied in exactly the same research assays, the same research methodologies that biotech companies are actually studying drugs. And that's a really important part of the emerging story of food as medicine. Because we have these tools that have been used to develop drugs, instead of putting a drug into the system, we can actually put a food. And this is true whether it's, in cells growing on a petri dish or in tissue culture plate, or whether we're testing it in an animal model, or whether we're doing a clinical trial. We can actually use the same rigorous tools. So, for example, I'll give you a simple example. Who hasn't heard about the ability for cranberries to help women resist bladder infections?
Well, we've certainly talked about it here on the People's Pharmacy, but the story is a little bit complicated.
It's incredibly complicated because, in fact, we now know that cranberries and the bioactives, the natural chemicals that are present in them, probably have a big effect on the gut bacteria. And it's through the gut bacteria that it alters the immune response, which then can help protect the bladder. And cranberry juice and another juice, pomegranate juice, we also know has an effect on the gut bacteria as well. One of the most stunning pieces of research I've seen in the last several years came out of Paris from the Institut Gustave Roussy. There is a researcher there named Dr. Laurence Zitvogel, who just received the Legion of Honor medal in France for her research that showed that cancer patients who are receiving immunotherapy will either respond or not respond to the medical treatments. And we're still struggling to figure out what are the reasons that some people respond and others don't. Well, Dr. Zitvogel's work examined real patients and found that one of the big differences between a responder versus a cancer patient who didn't respond to immune therapy was a single bacteria called Akkermansia mucinophila. This is actually a recently discovered bacteria. It's only been known for about a decade. And you cannot you can't put it into your body by eating a probiotic. You can only influence its growth with food. So pomegranate juice, for example, helps to create a nice mucus layer in the gut that bacteria loves to grow in. And so that's another connection between a diet and the immune system that actually can help us resist disease, even to help medicines work better. Another really interesting food are broccoli sprouts. There was a study that was actually done examining young people receiving the flu vaccine, right? So it's a nasal spray you can get to get flu vaccine, and they gave half of the patients either a shake made with broccoli sprouts, kind of a smoothie, and then gave them the vaccine versus a placebo. So this is a real clinical trial with no broccoli sprouts. And they found that the participants who actually had 2 cups of broccoli sprouts a day responded by having 22 times better of an immune response compared to the people who did the young people who were receiving the flu vaccine that didn't have it. So in other words, just having the broccoli sprouts and the flu vaccine boosted the immune system. And when they actually counted the particles of virus that were in the nose, you can do a little swab and count the virus particles. Broccoli sprout eaters actually had dramatically fewer virus particles as well. So these were just a few examples of how the immune system can be powerfully amplified, even in the setting of medicines, to be able to make the immune system perform better.
Well, that is totally amazing. So why aren't doctors prescribing broccoli sprouts along with flu vaccines?
That's a great question. So this is a little bit of the evolving sociology of medicine. I think that as somebody who went to medical school in the 80s and trained at one of the best hospitals in the world, my education and the practice of medicine is largely governed by looking for diseases and then finding ways to intercept the diseases. So it's sort of like hammers looking for nails to hit. And, when I was taking care of patients at the VA hospital, all of my patients, after hearing what kind of treatments that they needed to be on and getting the prescriptions handed to them by either myself or my nurse, on their way out the door, they would always ask me, "Hey, doc, what can I do for myself? What should I eat?" And I never knew the answer. I realized I wasn't taught that. So that's felt wrong to me. And so that's what led me on this journey to really begin asking, what is the science behind food and how can food be really used as medicine? So this is going to change as the science becomes surfaced and more people hear about this. So I do think that doctors of the future, the ones that are in medical school now, when they're out in practice, they will be talking about the role of food. But, for most of us who, grew up in the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s, the medical community around us was largely thinking only about surgery, medicines, or radiation, and then a little bit of rehab. Now we realize that between doctor's office visits, our patients can use food really to help amplify and activate their own health defenses.
Well, I think the trick is going to be, how do we educate people about particular foods? And I'm going to ask you in a moment what your top immune-boosting foods are. But I do occasionally take the opportunity to climb up on my soapbox because, we see so many commercials for medicines on television these days, or even when we're surfing the web. So it seems like every third commercial almost on the evening news is for some prescription drug or another. The Food and Drug Administration seems perfectly happy with that. But if somebody, some organization, some company wants to talk about the health benefits of food, like walnuts, for example, the FDA says, oh, no, you cannot advertise walnuts. They're an unapproved new drug.
Or pomegranate juice, right?
They went after pomegranate juice. They go after cherry juice. It's like, no, that's a drug. If you say it does anything to help the body, you are going to be in big trouble with us. So how do we get the word out that there, in fact, are therapeutic foods that really can have a powerful pharmacological effect on our body?
It's a great point. When it comes to medicines, it's the drug companies that actually make a claim. They teach doctors through medical education, and then the doctors pretty much evaluate whether or not the data is strong enough for practice, and it's the doctor telling the patient, informed by the pharmaceutical company. I think with foods it's different. The first thing is that we can't study foods like drugs. There's no single clinical trial that's regulated by the FDA with a package insert that, the thing that you throw away from the drugstore when most people get their medicines, that has all the clinical trial information. Food is really by the people, for the people. It's so elemental. It has such immediacy. You don't need an FDA approval. You don't need a doctor's prescription. But in fact, it's innate. It's innate to culture. It's innate to individuals and communities, and it's part of our social relations. There's a whole sociology behind food that makes it completely a different type of entity than drugs. That said, the point I'm trying to make is that there is real science supporting the health benefits of food, and it's starting to build up to critical mass now. The science is published. It's in the literature. Doctors and patients can both read that, and it doesn't require advertising to be able to make that point. So I think that as the community at large, doctors, patients, begin knowing where to look for the information, and this is where these movements of people that are interested in food and the food as medicine kind of movement starts to surface the information. People are going to hear about it, and it doesn't require a food company to put it on the label of something in the grocery store.
Dr. Lee, what are the top, let's say, 3 foods that can boost our immune system, and what kind of dose are we talking about?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is there's so many different foods, but I will tell you that some of the top foods for immune boosting are mushrooms. So mushrooms actually have a powerful component. They've got beta-glucans, which are a bioactive that can stimulate the immune system. They also contain fiber that actually activates the microbiome to actually be able to become much more active as well.
Dr. Lee,
yeah,
there are a lot of mushrooms. Which ones are your favorites?
Well, I'll tell you, when it comes to sort of eating, I love mushrooms myself, and so I love chanterelles, I love porcinis, and I love enoki mushrooms. All of those actually are quite powerful. But the good news for the average person who is just maybe even exploring mushrooms is the simple, lovely white button mushroom is also a great stimulator of the immune system. And so that's good news for people that love mushrooms because they're readily available and they're not terribly expensive.
You're listening to Dr. William Lee, physician, researcher, and president and founder of the Angiogenesis Foundation. He's worked on the development of more than 30 new medical treatments. His TED Talk, Can We Eat to Starve Cancer?, has garnered more than 11 million views. Dr. Lee has served on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and presented at the Vatican's Unite to Cure conference. His book is Eat to Beat Disease, the new science of how your body can heal itself.
I'm especially delighted to hear that mushrooms can be immune boosters. So chanterelles, porcinis, button, and he didn't mention, but I happen to love shiitake mushrooms.
Yes, they are delicious, and they're good for you.
And they do have some good science to support their use.
Absolutely.
After the break, we'll talk more about mushrooms. Mushroom barley soup, my favorite.
Does barley have an effect on the immune system and on angiogenesis?
What about foods like onions and garlic also happen to be my favorites?
Find out how we should eat to ward off premature aging and neurodegenerative diseases.
And what about herbs? Can herbs like rosemary make a difference?
I'll bet so.
What else can we do to maximize our health potential?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored in part by Kaya Biotics. Kaya Biotics offers the first probiotics which are both certified organic and hypoallergenic.
All probiotics are produced in Germany under laboratory conditions with high-quality ingredients and under strict regulatory oversight.
The 3 available formulas are created for very specific purposes, such as strengthening the immune system, fighting yeast infections, and helping with weight loss.
To learn more about Kaya Biotics probiotics and the important topic of gut health, you can visit their website, KayaBiotics.com. That's Kaya Biotics.com. Use the discount code PEOPLE for $10 off your first purchase. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. To purchase a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1161. The number again, 800-732-2334. You can also find it at peoplespharmacy.com. You can download the free podcast from iTunes or from our web store. We invite you to consider writing a review.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia, maker of high-potency cocoflavanol supplements supporting cognitive and cardiovascular health. More information at cocovia.com.
Can food help us ward off many of today's common ailments? What about neurodegenerative diseases? Are there herbs and spices that could be beneficial for memory?
Our guest is Dr. William Lee, president and founder of the Angiogenesis Foundation. He's worked on the development of more than 30 new medical treatments and served on the faculty of Harvard Medical School. His book is Eat to Beat Disease, the new science of how your body can heal itself.
Dr. Lee, you were just talking about mushrooms, and I have to tell you, my mom made the best mushroom barley soup on the planet. I mean, this was just such a special treat. Are there any benefits of barley?
Well, you're making my mouth water just talking about that because I also love mushroom barley soup. It turns out that not only are mushrooms great, but the same thing that is present in mushrooms, the beta-glucan, is also present in barley. And barley actually has a number of different benefits, so barley can actually also help boost the immune system. But there's another benefit to perhaps your mom's soup, which is that barley can actually also stimulate your body's stem cells to grow healthy blood vessels to improve your circulation. So a mushroom barley soup informed by science can not only activate the immune system, but also bring out your stem cells to help improve your circulation.
Let's talk about dose. How much mushroom barley soup should you be eating, and how often?
Well, so let's talk about dose for a second. It's a really important idea, and a relatively new one, although it's been hidden in plain sight. As you know, there are large clinical studies or population studies involving people, hundreds of thousands of people across countries. One of the largest studies is called the EPIC study, the European Perspective Investigation of Cancer, looking at what people are eating and how much they're eating and what the cancer outcome actually is. And so when you actually look at large studies like that, the answers, the doses are actually present right in the data that it's published. So, for example, and of course in smaller studies you also see the doses as well. For example, the white button mushroom has been studied to reduce risk of cancer as well as boost the immune system. And all you need is about a cup and a third of white button mushrooms a day. So that's sort of slicing them up and measuring it out. That's actually the equivalent that actually provides the benefits. When it comes to barley, just an eighth of a cup cooked barley actually helps produce that blood vessel circulation boosting effect. And so it is a little bit of an art to look through the research literature and the public health literature to find the exact doses that are used and found and discovered, but it's all there. And so one of the things that I'm doing with my organization, the Angiogenesis Foundation, is really collating all of the information out there that has science as well as clinical and public health benefit and extracting out what are the food doses, how can you combine foods together, like your mom's mushroom barley soup, and there are many other examples of that as well, in order to be able to give real life examples that people can stick to, so that this is not, so eating for health is not about elimination, but it's about adding. And it's not about forcing yourself towards foods that you might not like, but in fact leaning into the foods that you love.
Well, let's get a few more foods on our table, if you don't mind. You've mentioned broccoli stems, maybe in a smoothie. You've mentioned mushrooms. You talked about pomegranates and pomegranate juice. If we were to look at your refrigerator, for example, what kinds of other foods do you consume on a regular basis for both cancer prevention or treatment and or other conditions that might benefit from this food palette?
Yeah, well, so one of my favorite foods is, in fact, tomatoes. And not only do I love tomatoes because they taste great in a salad, but I know they're packed with vitamins like vitamin C. And I also happen to know that there's data to show that cooked tomatoes in a study of 40,000 men called the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, that men who ate 2 to 3 servings of cooked tomatoes, with each serving being a half a cup of tomato sauce, essentially, that those men had a 33% reduced risk of developing prostate cancer. So as a man, as somebody who loves tomatoes, and knowing that data, you'll often find tomato sauce in my refrigerator. And we even know why that actually works in terms of being cooked versus raw. And it turns out that there is a substance that many of us have heard of called lycopene, that when coming off the vine, lycopene on a tomato, a fresh tomato that you cut into a salad, has this lycopene in a chemical form that's not that easy to absorb. But when you heat it, like you cook it into a sauce, for example, you change the chemical structure from a form that the body doesn't absorb very easily to one in which the body avidly absorbs, and it gets right into your bloodstream. And guess what? Because lycopene is what we call a fat-soluble substance, it dissolves in fat. The best way to actually get lycopene to go into your bloodstream after eating tomato sauce is to cook it with olive oil. So now you have tomatoes cooked in olive oil into a sauce that reduces prostate cancer, and you've got the Mediterranean diet.
It sounds delicious, too.
Exactly. So, I don't think that eating for health is all about putting yourself into a state of deprivation. Human nature really hates to be deprived of things. I think the new food as medicine movement is delivering the scientific evidence that some of the things that we love to have, that we love to eat, actually can be beneficial, and now we're beginning to understand why.
And if we were in Italy making our tomato sauce with our olive oil, we'd probably dice and slice some onions and maybe some garlic.
Absolutely. And both onions and garlic belong to a family of foods called allium. And allium has a large amount of bioactives that are incredibly activating for the immune system. They can stop bad blood vessels from feeding cancer. And so, again, it's one of these foods that not only makes sense with other foods that actually are good for us, garlic, tomatoes, olive oil, but in fact, it actually activates the body's immune system and stops cancers from growing blood supply, so it starves cancers as well.
Dr. Lee, in your book, Eat to Beat Disease, you mention towards the end of the book that there are ways that we can eat to essentially slow down the ravages of aging, that we can try to ward off neurodegenerative diseases. Can you give us some hints about how we would go about that?
Well, neurodegeneration is a consequence of aging as our cells in our brains slow down. We normally think of neurodegeneration as sort of what's in the brain. And the thing about aging is that oftentimes when we see and feel and experience the signs of aging, it's because our cells and our organs have worn themselves down and are not being replaced with fresh cells for activity. So one way of actually staving off aging is to really be able to keep blood vessels and keep blood flow from being too insufficient. So angiogenic foods, or foods that actually stimulate blood vessels, are a great example of one way to actually keep the brain to have a really great blood supply. So we mentioned a couple of things that can stimulate blood vessels in the brain. One of the things, of course, is barley. It can stimulate blood vessels in the brain, but it turns out that chocolate made from cacao, so we're not talking about the milk and milk chocolate, we're not talking about the sugar that's often used in the confection called chocolate, but the cacao has been studied to be able to, when you eat cacao, high flavanol cacao, so this is really dark chocolate, let's call it 70% and higher. It turns out that you can actually double the amount of stem cells in your bloodstream, which then would help to build the circulation of the brain. This is a clinical study looking at people with heart disease that were given 2 cups of hot chocolate a day made with really hot, dark chocolate, and they could double the number of stem cells and also improve their blood flow substantially. Just a couple of examples of actually how to combat aging, slowing down of the brain, is to get better circulation going.
Sounds wonderful, actually. I love the idea that dark chocolate could be beneficial.
I'd like to ask about spices and herbs, because we've been talking primarily about food, but we spoke with a researcher, I think he was in California, who had spent time in Italy and had been studying a culture kind of remote and a village where people really live to be ripe old age, oftentimes 100 or greater. And he said rosemary was everywhere, and they consumed rosemary at almost every meal.
And in large quantities.
Is there any evidence that herbs like that rosemary might have an impact on the aging process?
Absolutely. So we've actually taken a look at what's in rosemary and other spices and herbs, right? So rosemary actually has a natural compound called rosmarinic acid that actually helps the body's blood vessel system right-size itself, which is actually something that would be important for aging. So it can have an anti-angiogenic, cancer-fighting effect. And not just rosemary when it comes to the Mediterranean, but oregano can help the blood supply. Turmeric, which is also sometimes used in the Mediterranean, and cinnamon. These are all these kinds of spices and herbs that we've heard about that can be helpful to us. The interesting thing that's important to know about spices is that they're exceedingly difficult to study in humans. It's very difficult. Ironically, although you would think that you could actually measure out an herb or a spice like a medicine, when they're incorporated in food, because the herbs and spices tend to be added to the food in ways that make the food taste great, the clinical studies are much less precise in terms of how much herb needs to be done. But that too will change. I think that it would be possible to, in fact, look at what the dose of rosmarinic acid is to be able to fight a disease perhaps like breast cancer, because one of the interesting discoveries is that rosmarinic acid actually helps the body's tumor suppressor genes work, for example, to fight breast cancer. So it actually activates a gene. It turns on your own DNA that can help fight breast cancer. So we're beginning to dive deep into the how of why herbs and spices work. The how much is something that's still in the future to be studied.
Dr. Lee, what are your top recommendations for what we can all do on a daily basis to maximize our health potential?
I get asked this question all the time because it's there are so many foods that are out there. We've cataloged more than 200 different foods that have evidence, scientific and clinical and public health evidence that activate your health defense systems. I approach it this way. I know that I have 5 health defense systems in the body: angiogenesis, our regeneration, microbiome, our DNA protection, and immunity. And so I try to pick foods that can actually stimulate one of these systems, each of these systems every day. So I try to pick 5 foods that match with each of the defense systems. And on average, I think most of us eat, we think about 3 meals a day, but most of us eat about 5 times a day. So breakfast, lunch, dinner, maybe a couple of snacks, or maybe a dessert. And so the idea for me is you can live your whole life with a huge amount of food variety, dietary variety, which in fact is very important for our microbiome. Our gut bacteria loves to have diversity. They really don't like to have the same thing all the time. And so it's possible to have variety, to be flexible, as long as we're thinking about our defense systems, there's 5 of them, and to try to pick foods that actually stimulate each one of them. Now, I sometimes get asked, well, so what do I do every day that I really enjoy? And I think that there are, for example, tea, green tea, black tea, those beverages actually activate all the defense systems at the same time. So I try to put tea into my diet every single day. Nuts, tree nuts, although some people do have allergies to nuts, tree nuts are really great. Like walnuts are fantastic foods to have, and you don't need to have a lot of them. Just a couple of handfuls a week are enough to actually stimulate your immune system, feed your microbiome, keep your blood vessels in good shape, fight off cancer. So nuts are an easy one. And then in the summer, one of my favorite things to do is to go to the farmer's market, although you can also find it in the grocery stores, to look for something called stone fruit. And stone fruit is really any juicy fruit that's got a pit in it. So an apricot, a mango, a nectarine.
Plums.
Plums,
That's
right?
Joe's favorite, I think.
Pick the things that you love. I mean, the things that our body craves because they're seasonal and fresh, they tend to have good things with it. And then, of course, there have been lots of studies to show that people who eat seafood regularly live longer for all kinds of reasons. And fish needs to be approached with a bit of caution because some fish contain a lot of mercury, but there's a lot of fish lower in the food chain that are richly packed with omega-3 fatty acids. But even clams are good, like manila clams are good. And then for people that are more foodies, I would point out that some fish eggs like botarga, which is found in the Mediterranean, delicious shaved on pasta, or even squid ink, the black pasta you see in restaurants. Those actually activate the immune system, protect your stem cells, can help starve cancers, and can influence and protect your DNA. And so I think that the beautiful thing about food is its diversity, and that it's hard to beat Mother Nature with. There's so much that's out there that's good for us. It's all about trying to organize the science, know what the evidence is, and then match what your own preferences is with what the science tells us.
Dr. William Li, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
It's a pleasure having participated. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Dr. William Li. He's a physician, researcher, and president and founder of the Angiogenesis Foundation. He has served on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and written Eat to Beat Disease, the new science of how your body can heal itself. There's a link to his TED Talk on our website, and we also are including a recipe for mushroom barley soup.
Well, when you think about all the foods that he's mentioned, they just make my mouth water. Barley, mushrooms, tomatoes, broccoli sprouts, chocolate,
Plums,
onions, garlic, rosemary, oregano, turmeric, cinnamon, tea, nuts, and, of course, my favorite, plums. Well, that's all the time we have. Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1161. That number, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit the site, you can share your thoughts about today's show. You'll also be able to listen to some portions of our interview that we just couldn't fit into this hour. They are in the podcast, though, and you'll find them online at peoplespharmacy.com. Look for show 1161. What is the evidence for food as medicine?
You can also sign up for the free online newsletter or subscribe to the free podcast. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money. If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in. Even a small donation can make a big difference. All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate. Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes the show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support.